Heartland of America and the gateway to the West. Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. Welcome to Coast AM, and also welcome new affiliate WMSAAM, Messina, New York. Welcome to the family. Next hour, is weather being manipulated? And what about the journey to the center of the earth? Brooks Agnew joins us on Coast AM. Here's what's happening. The United States will try self-professed September 11 mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 4 co-conspirators in Guantanamo Bay, a political setback for President Barack Obama, who had promised to prosecute them in a criminal court. Attorney General Eric Holder blamed lawmakers for the policy reversal, saying their decision in January to block funding for prosecuting the 9/11 suspects in a U.S. criminal court tied our hands and forced the administration to resume military trials. Dr. Jerome Corsi with us, regular contributor to Coast AM. Jerry, this situation, whether to try in a criminal court or Guantanamo Bay, a military court, give me the difference, would you?
Well, George, in a criminal court, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed would get all the rights of a criminal defendant. In other words, if the evidence that was obtained against him was done through waterboarding, which it was, which President Obama has objected to as torture, that evidence could be thrown out. How he was captured, the entire nature of the basic criminal civil rights, all the rights any defendant in a criminal court would get, would have to be extended to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Now, by going the route of trying Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in a military court, those same rights do not have to be extended, so the rules are less favorable to the defendant. And it's a major setback for the administration. Eric Holder, since 2009, has insisted that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed would be tried in a criminal court in New York, and President Obama campaigned not only on that waterboarding was torture, but that terrorists like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed ought to be extended the rights that criminal defendants in U.S. trials get and should not be tried in a military court.
Jerry, the fact that this guy is a self-professed mastermind in 9/11, what does this do to so many people who believe that 9/11 was an inside job?
Well, it eliminates a lot of the ability to do a questioning, which could occur in a criminal trial. So those who would want to pursue alternative theories of 9/11, want to see different lines of defense, that's not going to happen now, because in a military tribunal, the inquiry will be limited to much more defined areas. So again, those who basically see 9/11 as an inside job will be shut out in a military tribunal, which is what Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's going to face now.
And probably the death penalty, I assume?
I would think so. I mean, I guess the political theater here, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed would have liked a criminal trial. He would have liked the opportunity to have blamed the United States and to have engaged in whatever bizarre behavior he may have engaged in. That's now denied. But again, the 9/11 families who feel that they want justice here, some are going to be happy because they want Khalid Sheikh Mohammed prosecuted under tribunals. Others are not going to be happy because the inquiry is going to be limited, questions are not going to be able to be raised, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's rights are going to be dramatically limited under a military tribunal.
All right, Jerry, what's new with the Red Alert newsletter?
Well, again, I'm following very closely, George, the coming crisis. We're clearly, in the United States, in terms of our fiscal responsibility, with now a $1.65 trillion budget deficit projected, our national debt at $14 trillion, we're facing a real budget crisis. And I think in the next few weeks we're going to have a showdown between Republicans who want to cut trillions of dollars from federal spending and Democrats who are going to try to hold the line and say, well, let's raise taxes on the rich, et cetera. I don't think we could raise taxes enough on the rich. It's a real budget crisis, and one that's not going to be easily or without major pain. We've got to do something to cut spending. Otherwise, we're going to go the route of Greece and Portugal and the countries in the EU which cannot control their budgets. And this, I've been following this very closely in Red Alert newsletter, which is free through WND. And I think in the next few weeks we're going to see a real showdown in Congress over this issue.
All right, very good. Thank you. Jerry Corsi. Workers used a milky bathwater dye as they frantically tried to trace the path of radioactive water seeping into the ocean from Japan's tsunami-damaged nuclear plant. The crack in a maintenance pit discovered over the weekend was the latest confirmation that radioactivity continues to spill into the environment. The leak is a symptom of the primary difficulty of the Fukushima complex. Radioactive water is pooling around the plant and preventing workers from powering up cooling systems needed to stabilize dangerously vulnerable fuel rods. Folks, the situation is not under control. Something else that isn't apparently under control, the government will now order emergency checks of certain older model Boeing 737s for the kind of fatigue cracks that prompted Southwest Airlines to cancel hundreds of flights. The Federal Aviation Administration directive on 737-300 fuselage inspections applies to domestic carriers, but overseas regulators are expected to follow with the airlines operating in their countries. The order will cover 175 planes globally. While the possible theft of millions of email addresses from an advertising company, several large companies have started warning customers, I got one today, to expect fraudulent emails that try to coax account login information from them. Be careful. Companies behind such brands as Chase, Citi, and Best Buy said hackers may have learned their email addresses because of a security breach of a Dallas-based company called Epsilon that manages email communications. Melting mountain glaciers are making sea levels rise faster now than at any time in the last 350 years, according to new research. Several universities looked at longer time scales than usual for their study. They mapped changes in 270 of the largest glaciers between Chile and Argentina since the Little Ice Age. Studies showed glaciers have lost volume on average of 10 to 100 times faster in the last 30 years. The rapid rate is linked to their contribution to global sea level rises. Pupils at a Scotland school, and we got this story for you at coasttocoastam.com, had to run for cover when it started raining worms during their physical education class. The teacher was leading a group of pupils playing football when dozens of worms began plummeting from the sky. The boys had to abandon their lesson as the earthworms fell during the bizarre incident. There were about 120 worms that fell on the kids. 10 years ago, a man calling himself John Teeter posted on the internet that he was a time traveler from the year 2036. Most people agree that he made some very accurate statements about technology, science, and the world around us. After reading the posts online, Oliver Williams gathered everything John wrote into a single website. Since then, people still debate, still wonder about John Teeter's predictions, their meaning, their true purpose. Up next, Oliver Williams on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. Oliver Williams, the website editor for the time travel story of John Teeter. He first saw John's internet postings in the fall of 2002, and after reading many of the sites where John was discussed, Oliver gathered the posts that John had left online, edited them, as I mentioned, into a single website, which is johnteeter.com. The website also contains email and news events that point to subjects that John spoke about. It's only time, it's poignant to have Oliver back on Coast to Coast AM, and here he is. Oliver, how you been?
Hey, George, good to talk to you again.
You too. And I just noticed you're starting to update the website again. You took a little hiatus. Why'd you back off, and why are you back in again?
Well, you and I have been talking about this for a few years now, and as I told you before, I go back and forth. There are periods of time where I look at this and I go, there's no way this can be real. And then I'll see things that happen in the news, or I'll get email from somebody, and I'm looking at it and I'm just bewildered, and I say there's got to be something to this. So it's like a ping pong ball. I just keep going back and forth. And for a while there, for a long period of time, I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it, and then a couple of things popped up in the news, and now I'm back into it again. And I have one announcement. I was going to wait till I had this locked up, but I got an email from Larry Haber,
Oh, yes, the attorney for the John Teeter family. Okay, go ahead.
I've been trying to get a hold of him and talk him into this for about 2 years, and he finally agreed to this. I am going to be able to interview Kay. I've been trying to get him to do this for a couple of years. And
that's the mother,
that's
right?
The mother. He wrote me back and said, yes, she will agree to interview you, or you can interview her, but it's going to be on their terms, and he's going to get back to me. So I got that that email on Saturday. So
now you remember, though, Oliver, I interviewed her, too, but it was on their terms, and that was through Larry. We never had an opportunity to talk to her. I would ask Larry a question. He'd ask her. She would tell him. We never heard her voice, and then Larry would give us the answer.
I asked if it was okay if I interviewed her over the phone and then made that recording, and he did not say no to that. So that's what I'm hoping they'll let me do. Okay,
well, you find out if we have permission to use your recording if you give it to us. Okay?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, let's talk a little bit about John Teeter. Of course, we have hundreds of thousands of new listeners that join us every month. And they probably don't know who the heck he is. I've tried to describe it, but you go ahead.
Well, as you may or may not know, George, it is almost exactly 10 years today that John Teeter left. And it was 10 years ago in the year 2000 in March where this person came on the Internet and he went into a couple of science forums and he said, I'm a time traveler from the future and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. And for a period of about 3 months, he answered questions about science, technology, the future. He made what some people consider to be predictions. And at the time, nobody really took him seriously. It wasn't until after he left, about 3 months later, that some of the things that he said started to happen. And the snowball just started at that point, and more people started paying attention to it. And I found out about this about 2 or 3 years after he left, and that's when I started putting the website together. But you could run down a list of things you could call predictions. You know, he talked about time travel at CERN. He made accurate predictions about a very obscure IBM computer that only a few people in the world would have known. Mm-hmm. He mentioned that a skyscraper would be missing in New York. He talked about mad cow. He talked about how our Constitution would be torn away from us. He talked about the space shuttle, about China putting men in space. He said Stephen Hawking would change his mind on time travel. He talked about a whole series of things that a lot of people look at now and say that's absolutely what happened.
What if John Teeter is a guy who works for the government, a guy in the inside, a guy who knows things that we don't know, and he's trying to leak this stuff out to us, Oliver?
That's actually becoming a more popular theory now, George. In the last year or so, there's been some speculation and some evidence on the Internet, which is one of the reasons I want to try to interview Kay, that this whole exercise in writing these posts was in trying to send messages to somebody, whether it was other versions of John that were time traveling or people that knew what they were reading and we didn't. The speculation is that they were a very tech-savvy scientist. They may have been somebody who worked for CERN. So that is a popular theory, that it's not a time traveler, but somebody who knew this stuff and was trying to get it out.
He talked a little bit about civil war. Primarily, he talked about civil war in the United States, but I'm looking at the Middle East, and I'm going, whoa, I wonder if he had that included in it.
That's actually the biggest criticism about his post. It's the one thing that stands out as a sore thumb, is that he was wrong about that. He said a civil war was going to start in the United States, but it's also the one thing he talked about where he gave multiple dates. It's almost as if two people were giving the same prediction because he never got the date right. So some people think that either he was trying to send a message with that. In other words, he was talking about civil war, but he was trying to send a code about the Civil War, or he wasn't talking about a civil war at all. Of course, you could look at this whole thing and go, that's proof that, he's not who he said he was. But if you understand the way he talked about time travel and how it worked, it's also possible that he was talking about an alternate reality. He was talking about a civil war that he experienced where he came from, but not necessarily something that happened here or something that could have been changed here.
Oliver, when did he stop posting on the Internet?
He stopped posting in the end of March in 2001.
Did he say why he was going away?
Yeah, the way he described how time travel worked, he said he had certain windows that he could leave and arrive in. And the window for his departure was at the end of March or right at the beginning of April. So the reason he stopped posting was he said he was leaving to go home. And after that, he was never heard from again.
Now, if it's real, and according to the attorney in Florida that I've interviewed, and you're going to interview the mother, he represents the family. They moved from Florida to somewhere in the Midwest, the Plains, maybe Nebraska. He wasn't too specific. But there is a little John Teeter, he said, right?
Correct. When John arrived here 10 years ago, he
from 2036.
From 2036. He spent time with his family in 1998, 2000, 2001. And he said that he interacted with his young self. In fact, that younger version of him, they told him that he was his uncle or they were related. So once John left, that little John is here now, and he'd be grown up. He'd be 12, 13 years old right now. So,
isn't there some kind of a time travel law here, Oliver, that if you see yourself, something happens to you?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. A lot of people call that the grandfather paradox. And the idea there is that time travel has to be impossible because if you go back in time and kill your grandfather, you'd never be born.
That's right.
But just a couple of months ago, or maybe it was the last time we spoke, real science now is coming out and saying that that's not true, that time travel, the way John described it, is possible, and that the grandfather paradox is something that you can get around that way. So and that's exactly what John said 10 years ago.
Oliver, when we started talking about this years ago, there was always talk about a John Teeter movie. I thought for a moment this was one heck of a great publicity stunt by some movie studio that was doing this, and then out comes the Time Traveler movie. Whatever happened to that?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, too, because here's what I know about that. And this is from emails and messages that I get from some other folks. There was an actor who was in that film. His name is Michael Hartson. And if you look him up, he's actually a real actor. He's been in a couple of movies and some other things. And there's a group in Florida that actually got an interview with him. And they posted that video online. And I actually have a link to that on our site. But in there, he hints around about the movie, and one of the things he says is that the timing is very, very specific, that the family or whoever made the movie is very, very specific about when it's going to come out, and it'll come out when they're ready. So I guess the idea is that, either they're not happy with it, didn't work out the way they wanted to, or for some reason there's a specific time when it's going to come out.
Tell me more about Kay. What do we know about the mother?
Well, again, when I first started doing this and I heard about Kay, it was something that it was I put on the back burner because it had nothing to do with the original posts. But then when Larry came out, and I started getting more and more email from people that have either contacted Larry or tried to contact Kay, I started taking it a little more seriously. And the speculation is that when John left, Kay and young John and the family moved from Florida to somewhere in Omaha. And I think the city was, I'm sorry, they moved to Nebraska. I think the city was Omaha where they moved. Now, as you said, you got an interview with her through Larry, and that's kind of the only contact anybody has had with her. And, when you go back and listen to that interview, it sounds like he's talking to a real person. You hear the fear, and it didn't sound like it was made up. It's just the most bizarre interview I've ever heard.
Yeah, the whole thing is strange. It really is, Oliver. And I keep saying the guy's either a time traveler, a very intuitive person, or a government insider. I'm tipping toward the government insider. I just don't know.
One of the other things that keeps coming up, and, George, this is the biggest question now that's asked about, John, is why was it done? Nobody cares about whether or not it's real or not anymore. They want to know why. And if you look at it, it doesn't appear that anybody's made a fortune off of this. It doesn't look like, there was a book that came out, and it's not published anymore, but you go on eBay and you find it for like $800-900.
Wow.
So it's, the people that bought it originally are making more money than whoever put the book out. So it's just a whole set of bizarre circumstances.
Well, it sure is. Look, if you need more information on this incredible story, you can go to the website that Oliver monitors. It's called John Teeter, JohnTitor.com. I've got to tell you, one of the most bizarre stories I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot. When we come back in just a moment right here on Coast to Coast AM, we're going to take phone calls with Oliver Williams about the John Teeter story, the John Teeter legacy. I'm George Norrie. We'll be right back on Coast to Coast AM. Well, next hour, Brooks Agnew joins us. We'll talk about time travel, weather manipulation, and journey to the center of the earth. And welcome back. We're going to take your phone calls for the remaining portion of this hour. Oliver Williams with us. Oliver, why do you think this John Teeter guy posted? Even if he was a government whistleblower, what is the motive here? What is he trying to get out to us?
George, I think that whoever did this, whatever they were trying to get a message out to somebody who is specifically listening for that message, whether it had to do with technology or time travel or science or politics, whatever it was. I believe they were broadcasting to a very specific audience that was not apparent at the time. That's why I think he was doing it.
Well, you may be right. What about his legacy? Will it live on forever?
The legacy of John Teeter, in my opinion, whether it was real or not, what it gave us was this was the first time, in my opinion, where people actually believed time travel could be real. I mean, the science was real. He had pictures of his machine. The story was consistent. And a lot of people, for the first time, I think, really believe that it's possible to time travel, where you get into a machine, turn it on, and you go into the past or you go into the future. And I think it's got to say something that if you do a Google search for John Teeter, that he pops up everywhere. It's like the number 3 or 4 listing now on a general search for time travel, or if you do a search for any scientists about time travel, John Teeter is there.
That's
and I think that says something about the story.
Sure does. Let's go to Brad, east of the Rockies, driving around in Georgia, and you're on Coast to Coast. Hi, Brad. Go ahead.
Hey, guys. How you doing? I love the show. And, hey, while I got you on the phone, when can I get my Android app? Because this FM and AM out here is ridiculous.
I've been saying this for a while, Brad. They tell me, as a matter of fact, they just emailed me a couple days ago. They are working on it. However, they do tell me if they don't get it, we may go to our own Coast to Coast app, which will work for you, too.
We would love it. That would be awesome. It is 2011. But, hey, I want to ask Mr. Williams, if you could touch base real quick on the actual, schematics of I think it was a GE, like a suitcase-sized time travel device that he used. This is one of the most fascinating stories I've ever heard. And if anything he said back when he was here, if it's still on the table to unfold, in the future, or if he's kind of going off kilter now and what he's saying is not.
Well, to start with the machine, what he did was he posted pictures of what he claimed was the operations manual from his time machine, which was, about the size of a large suitcase. And there's a cutaway drawing where you can see all the components of it. And, to my understanding, there's even an outstanding reward for anybody who can identify what this thing is. It's obviously a machine. It's obviously something, but nobody's been able to declare what it is. On the website, you may find it interesting. Somebody has actually applied for a U.S. patent for the machine and for the technology. Now, it's my understanding that this may be a little tongue-in-cheek, that you can apply for a patent for just about anything. But I do find it interesting that somebody went through the effort to actually do that. You can see the link. It goes right to the government site where the patent is. As far as things that are unfolding, I think what's most interesting, and this is the thing that we forget, is that if John was wrong about a lot of things, like he said, hey, this was going to happen and it didn't happen, or that was going to happen, it didn't happen, that would be more memorable than the fact that what he said is continuing to happen over and over again. And the thing that stands out for me is the development of time travel technology specifically centered at CERN. I did a Google search just last week, and again, more and more scientists are coming out and saying CERN is the key to time travel. Here's the theory. We think it's real. And basically the theory that they lay out is exactly what John said it was going to be. And don't forget, 10 years ago, this was nothing but science fiction. The idea of multiple realities and universes and time travel at all was complete science fiction. And now, 10 years later, everybody is sort of saying, oh, yeah, it might be true. Yeah, absolutely. And if it wasn't for John, would we even have any idea that that was possible?
Well, and 10 years ago, Oliver, most of us didn't even know what was going on at CERN. We didn't even know it existed, even though they were building it. He did. To me, that sounds like a guy on the inside.
Right, and that's a very popular theory.
Let's go to North Hollywood, California. It's Carlos on the wild card line. Carlos, you're on with Oliver Williams.
Terrific, great. I've been wanting to talk about this. It seems like you remember the first show I heard of you. You were wondering whether he had made a mistake and wanted to fix it. I'm also wondering along that line, perhaps he's leaving himself time markers to tell if he's in the right alternate dimension, so to speak. Maybe he's trying to fix things in that dimension so that it'll be the way he wants. He's traveling back and forth. Or maybe also, when 2001, maybe there was more than one John Titor.
Yeah, actually, that's, again, those are things that are starting to pick up on the Internet now. To go back to what you first said, according to John, the way time travel works, you can't fix something unless you stay there. In other words, if you identify something wrong on a timeline, you may be able to do something about it, but as soon as you leave, you're not going to be able to experience that fix at the next place that you go because each of these universes are separate and they're not connected to each other. The second thing you said about him leaving messages, that seems to be a very popular theory now, that if there were more than one or two Johns, that one way they could communicate with each other is by going back and forth through time and leaving these posts on the Internet so that one John can read it and see what was going on. He would leap around, leave another message. So the idea is that different Johns may have been writing these posts back then. In fact, there may be a John here now, according to the theory, and he's viewing everything that we're talking about, and he's going to go back to 2000 and post it on the Internet.
Okay, thanks, Oliver. Let's go to Nick, Oak Harbor, Washington, west of the Rockies. Go ahead, Nick.
Good evening, George.
Hi.
And your guest. I wanted to address your theory about John Titor possibly being a government insider. And I'm always amazed, and I don't mean any offense by this, but I'm always amazed how people like to find explanations for things that fit their present paradigm. And what I mean by that is I think that John spoke about some things that a government insider couldn't possibly have known even 10 years ago.
Well, you may be right about that, and I think it is only a theory. But, a lot of people have tried to think about this, and, back when it was happening and back when it started to gain notoriety, the theory was that it had to be a group of people, that there was no way you could get one person who could fake drawings and pictures, who knew about the IBM computer, who knew about time travel, who knew about what was going on at CERN, who could make accurate guesses about world politics. So at the time, it was thought it was a group of people. But now, if you try to pinpoint that, a conspiracy like that, somebody would come forward and say, we were having a laugh, and here's what we did, and that hasn't happened yet, and that's kind of curious.
Oliver, what about rumors that you are John Titor?
George, I get that all the time, and every time I'm on, you ask me about that, and the answer is no, I am not John Titor.
I keep asking, hoping one day you say yes.
I wish I was that clever. If I was John Titor, I guess I would figure out some other way to continue the message or whatever, but no, I'm not John Titor.
Well, and if you were, I'm looking for, okay, how does this guy profit? How's he making money? You're not making any money at all, and the thing's now 10 years old. You must have the patience of Job if you're John Titor.
Well, I suppose that's true. I mean, all I do is run the website. Every now and then I check to see if there's any news, and I get a chance to talk to you. I mean, I find that pretty exciting enough.
Let's go to Jim in Shiloh, Illinois. Hey, Jim, thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Hey, George, thanks a lot.
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask your guest if John Titor had made any mention of multiple anti-gravity device UFOs, so to speak, or identified anti-gravity devices rather than just the time machine.
Yeah, he was asked once about UFOs, and his opinion was, he said, we don't know what they are, but he speculates that they are more sophisticated time machines. That's what he thinks they are. And as far as the gravity units, he was asked once if there were more than one time machine, and said, oh, absolutely. So there's at least 10 10 units like mine, and there's even an advanced unit, a more advanced unit that other soldiers in his unit were using, which was more accurate, and you could travel farther or forward or backward.
This is just a great story, Oliver. Not only is it exciting, but when you look at these events unfold and you then compare them to some of the statements that Teeter made over the years, they are pretty uncanny, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, you get a weird feeling up your back, when you see some of this stuff in the news. And like I said, George, if every month a new story didn't come out about time travel coming out of CERN, this wouldn't be that big a deal, but it just doesn't end.
What did his time machine look like?
Well, let's see. It was fairly large and heavy, and it was longer than it was, in width. And you can see the photos. Heck, all you got to do is look it up on Google and you can find it. But it basically looks like a large suitcase that's long, and it opened up at the top. And if you look at it, he describes, it operates by using two what he calls micro singularities, which are mini black holes, and they're kept somehow encapsulated in the system. And I guess the gravity field is adjusted by injecting electrons on the surface of this thing. And the black holes have opposite spins and mass, which I guess allows them to create and manipulate the gravity field. And he talks about all the support systems that go along with it. He talks about, I think he called it a VGL system, which was a system of measuring the local gravity around the unit, which kept you basically locked to the Earth. Because a lot of people say, well, if you turn your time machine on, you're going to end up in space. Well, this system keeps that from happening. And there's cooling system and lasers and the computer that runs it. And if you look at this schematic, that's exactly what it looks like.
And he came back because he was looking for old computer parts, right?
Yeah, he claimed that in 2036, they needed a very obscure IBM computer that was manufactured in 1975 in Minnesota. And he said that the reason they needed it is it had some particular aspects to it that were not published by IBM and that only a handful of people knew. And, of course, at the time, nobody paid a whole lot of attention to this, but it wasn't until later after he left, and I had a chance to interview this guy. His name was Bob Dubke, I think, and he was in Minnesota. And he came forward and said whoever this guy was, he either knew somebody that worked on the machine or he worked on it, because there's only about 5 people that knew the details that he described in those posts. And I thought that was pretty bizarre myself.
Let's go to Mary in Jacksonville, Florida on Coast to Coast. Hey, Mary, welcome to the show.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have a question. Is there a young boy by the name of John Teeter that's around the age he's supposed to be?
Yeah, according to his mother and according to Larry, yes, there is a young John Teeter in our time now. And I think he said in 1990, he was born in 98, so however old that would be, 12 or 13 now.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much, guys. Great show.
There you go. I thought for a moment she was going to say she met the little guy.
Well, I'm Kay, and here he is.
Let's go to Pittsburgh. Hey, Mike, you're on with us. Go ahead.
I was listening to the show there a few years ago before election, and he said that we was going to have a woman president.
He did. I think he said there was speculation that a woman was going to run for president. That's correct. He did say that. Actually, the one definitive thing he did say about the president now is that they were going to compare themselves to Lincoln. And as you may recall, President Obama did do that at the early part of the election, and now I see in the news they're doing it again.
Yeah.
How about that? Okay, hey, thank you very much. Oliver, you've been watching this for 10 years. What's your personal gut tell you about the message? Not the man, but the message.
I think the message is a tragedy, in my opinion. I think if time travel is possible, when you look at the breadth of everything he said and his attitude and the way he did it, time travel is not something that we should fantasize about. It's one of those things that just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. I think that traveling in time may be very hazardous, may be very stressful, and it may change not only us, but wherever we go in ways that we can't possibly imagine. That's what I think the message is.
Well, let's go to Jerry, Atlanta, Georgia. Take it away, Jerry.
Good evening, George. Good evening, I believe I may be able to identify at least one of the sources of the going back to visiting your younger self. Robert A. Heinlein, I know that you're friends with Jerry Pournelle. That was a very famous part of Time Enough to Love, when Lazarus Long traveled back prior to visiting his younger self, and supposedly the more peaceful period right before World War I, but overshot it and actually ended up a few months before. I've always been highly suspicious of that part of the story. Add to the fact most of the drawings appear to be similar to line drawings that used to be done by the military in the 60s, where they trotted and dragged in draft school. I don't think it would be too hard to get a science fiction author and one of his draftsman buddies to draw up said pictures.
So you think the whole thing's a hoax, Jerry?
Possibly, very much so. I haven't seen any conclusive evidence.
Okay, but you're right. And if it is, well, you haven't ruled out a hoax, Oliver, have you?
I haven't, but one interesting thing to think about is John Titor may be a time traveler, but he might also be a liar. So there may be a whole lot of truth here and a few bits of untruth. The people that have speculated about those pictures, as you said, and consider also that the world John came from was much more different than ours. They were recovering from a world war, and technology was much more primitive than it is now because they're trying to recover. And, he said, hey, we use typewriters, we use printers. A lot of the things you don't use anymore, we do use. So some people have looked at those drawings and said, you know what, they look exactly like government drawings. This is exactly what they would look like. And, I've seen operation manuals from, fighter planes that people have compared it to. And if you look at those, they're just as crude and weird looking, just like those drawings are. So it's hard to say one way or the other.
What was the most profound thing you think John Titor said?
I think John was trying to warn us, and he was very angry about that. Early on, he said, things are going to change. You are going to lose your Constitution. You are going to go through a period of time where things that you were familiar with and that you hold on to are going to be torn away from you. And I'm afraid that message has gotten lost or convoluted because of, is it true, is it not true? But some of the things he said, the 10 things that he said that we should all do, if you look in the Post, I can't remember them offhand, but he gave a list he said, listen, to get ready for the future, here are 10 things you got to do. And I think things like that are lost. And I think those are some of the most important things he said.
Well, I think so, too. Let's go to Alyssa in Portland, Oregon. Hi, Alyssa.
Hi, George. How are you tonight?
Okay.
Hey, I was wondering what your friend who claims that the world's going to end here on May 21st and wants you to donate to his cause has to say about this John Titor theory.
Who knows? Now, don't call him my friend. I don't know him that well.
Your acquaintance.
My guest, who's been on the show.
Did he mention anything about why he couldn't get the parts in the future?
Yeah, he said that the computer systems then, they couldn't find them. They couldn't identify the computer and they couldn't find them. And a lot of them have been damaged by EMP. So he said there were a lot of computers laying around, but none of them worked.
Talk us through the website, Oliver. We've got a few seconds here. Just tell us where people should go if they want more information on John Titor.
You could go to our website, which is johntitor.com. And, if you look at the website, I have to apologize. It's about 1 million years old, and we are in the process now of trying to update it, make it a little more user-friendly. So go there, take a look at our archives, and continue to watch it, because if anything happens quickly with Kay or with anything else, I'm going to put it right up there.
All right, very good. Oliver, thanks so much for being on the program. Do keep in touch with us if you get a chance to talk to Kay, the apparent mother of John Titor. Would you?
George.
All right, we'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Brooks Agnew joins us. Well, get ready for a fascinating 3 hours with scientist Dr. Brooks Agnew. We're going to be talking about remembering the future, the physics of the soul and time travel, weather manipulation, and what is going on. Get an update on the journey to the center of the planet. All that is next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back. Dr. Brooks Agnew, scientist, engineer, more than 25 years experience designing and improving manufacturing processes for numerous Fortune 500 companies. And I've spent most of his time hanging around Caltech as a youngster and the folks who co-opt at Jet Propulsion Labs, and he's currently the president and CEO of Vision Motor Cars, incorporating designing and manufacturing affordable electrical vehicles for highway use A major program with Dr. Agnew tonight. We're going to be talking about HAARP, weather control, a little bit of time travel, and, of course, what's going on, the journey to the center of the earth. Here, back again, is Dr. Brooks Agnew. Brooks, how are you?
I am doing so fine, George. Thank you so much for having me on the program.
My pleasure. Hey, tell me a little bit about the Vision Motor Cars. What are you doing there?
Well, in 2006, I pretty much retired from the automotive industry after a little more than 23 years in the business. I just kind of felt that major car makers were going in the wrong direction, and they're still running commercials with tires smoking, sideways drifting, 500 horsepower. Well, I don't think they get it. I mean, people don't want to break every traffic law ever written by the time they hit second gear. They want to be able to buy a house and put their kids through college, and they're tired of spending $500 a month on gasoline going to and from work. So we set about designing and manufacturing an affordable electric vehicle. And late last year, we finished the vehicle, we finished the prototypes, and this year we're going into manufacturing with it. So we're starting with a light pickup truck, which is very practical and useful for light delivery or people that commute or people that just like to drive a truck. So works out really well.
Fantastic. Let's get an update from you, Brooks, for a few minutes here on the plans to go into the center of the earth. You were thinking about a Russian ship. I'm not sure that worked out. Where do we stand on this?
Well, it's a long saga. As it turns out, these are Russian international waters, so we have to use a Russian ship. We tried using Norwegian ships and Canadian ships, and they just won't sail to the area that we want to go. So it's got to be the Russian ship. Now, that being said, the Russian shipping company is very excited about the expedition. They've supported it with a joint venture. We've got a 450-foot-long, 23,000-ton nuclear-powered icebreaker. It'll only carry 100 passengers, so we have to be very discriminating as to who we put on there to make sure we get a good, solid scientific staff. And we've got people from Stanford, and we've got papers from Washington University and Harvard and MIT, so we've got a very good, solid scientific base. And we're actually sailing to an area above the Arctic Circle that no one has ever been to by sea. Now, it's been flown over a few times, not the least of which is Admiral Byrd, but no one's ever been there by sea, just because these are Russian international waters and they don't go there. So we're not really going into the center of the earth, but there is an ancient legend that there is an opening into the earth up there. And we couldn't, of course, convince the Russians to sail their ship into it, but they'll get us close to the opening, if there is one, and we'll fly over it with a helicopter and photograph it. And the idea is that we will stream live from the ship during the entire cruise from at least 4 channels going 24 hours a day. So what we see, the people will see. Now, you asked what's the progress. Obviously, with only 100 berths, we can't take everybody on the planet. But everybody wants to go. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of people that have written this. So we realize that everyone's going to experience this through film, through some kind, either on a DVD in a theater or on some television special. So Hollywood had to get integrally involved. And so we began speaking to Hollywood talent about a year and a half ago, and we now finally have some personalities that are financially solid enough to be able to back this. And we've just now finished the screenplay. Yes, you have to write a screenplay for a documentary. I didn't know that. And that is going to the producer this next week. So we are making progress.
Well, you can write up to the point of going into the hole.
Yeah.
And then what, right?
Well, yeah, that's it. I mean, we there's a theory, not a theory, but there's a legend. And it goes way back. I mean, before Edmund Halley, who first wrote about it in the 1600s, that there may be an ancient civilization that got wiped off the surface, or at least had to retreat off the surface into the interior of the earth. We backed this up last fall when we went to Egypt. We followed up on again. I told you I was going to.
Yes.
And it turns out that there are records going all the way back to Abydos in Egypt that say that the ancient society that built those edifices retreated into the into the earth. Now, we don't know if that means caves or if they actually, were driven by some cataclysm to live off the surface. And after a couple of decades, it became impossible for them to return to the surface. But they're more ancient than any civilization that lives on the surface. And if that's true, then they may come out to see us. And when they do, we'll get it on film.
As you mentioned, Egypt, Zahi Hawass, who headed up their antiquities, was leaving his post, and I hear he's back in again, so he's going to stick around.
It's a difficult thing to leave for him. He has such a passionate desire to make sure that Egypt is remembered as the one who not only made these things anciently, although there's a lot of controversy about that. Even his own university in Cairo recently released a paper that said they're pretty convinced that these things are at least 13,000 years old and maybe older than that. Of course, that predates any before Egypt was even Egypt. So, and they're beginning to admit that maybe off-worlders help build these things because of the precision and the alignment with Sirius and Orion. These are not things that primitive people would have thought about. Not that people that could build an edifice like Cheops were primitive, but there you go. You have this this hold that Zahi Hawass has had on these antiquities for so long, and really, if it wasn't for him, the whole place would have been looted years ago. I mean, it's just unbelievable how much they've already lost to other nations who have come in and just taken stuff home with them.
Brooks, as people would go into the center, into the hole, I guess via the tip there from the ocean, the curvature is so ever so slight, you don't even know you're doing it, right?
Yeah, that's true. And that's how I actually got involved with the expedition way back in 2005. They had posted a question, how do we tell if we're sailing into an opening or not? And I tackled the question, and I said, well, maybe we could use GPS. So we investigated that and found that, well, at above the 80th parallel, you can only see 3 satellites from sea level, and that's not enough to get an altitude precise enough. Now, it is if you're flying a plane at 40,000 feet, but not at sea level. So the next was to use sonar, bounce it off the bottom and see if the ocean gets shallower or something. But that wasn't sound, because what if the bottom was coming up towards you, the topology of the bottom of the sea? So we couldn't use an altimeter because sea level's pretty much always sea level. And so the idea was to build a precision gyroscope and actually map the curvature of the Earth. In other words, the rate at which it curves based on how far forward you sail. If we were sailing into an opening, then the radius would be noticeably smaller, and that gyroscope would begin over-rotating. At that point, we'd realize that we were sailing over the lip into something, and we would then start tacking back and forth to try to map the circumference of this opening. Some say it's several hundred miles across, and of course it is. You'd never be able to see it from sea level.
If it's there, Brooks, why is it such a secret? What is there that they're hiding?
I'm not really sure. In 2007, when the ice broke off, there was a very strange wind that blew, and conditions with warming and everything were just right. A huge continent-sized piece of ice broke off and opened what we call the Northwest Passage for the first time in, 100,000 years maybe. You could sail it, but nobody did. Nobody went there. There was no reason for anyone to sail. There was no commerce. So it really hasn't been sailed, at least from a civilian point of view. And I kind of say tongue-in-cheek, if the military would have sailed there, of course they would have shared all the information with us. But that's the only thing I can think of. We reviewed over 30,000 satellite photographs of this region, cloud cover, every single one of them. No clear view of the actual sea. So it's a mystery, and it's the ultimate myth to bust.
It sure is. Well, it's a dramatic story. Let's talk a little bit, just for a few minutes here, Brooks, before the break, and then we'll get into weather manipulation and some of the other things you're doing. Admiral Richard Byrd, when he apparently went into the center, went into the hole, he saw incredible things, didn't he?
Well, that's what's reported in a diary that has been circulated, and we've done as much investigation as probably anybody out there. And I just cannot be convinced that Admiral Byrd authored that diary. I know enough about his life, enough about his military history. He was a super patriot. He was dedicated to his country, and he would have given everything for it. And if he was ordered not to say anything about his flight over the North Pole in 1926 or over the South Pole in 1929, he would not have said anything to his dying day. But he did verbally discuss things with people. And those verbal discussions have grown over the years, over the last 75 years, into what we have today, this myth of his plane being seized by some tractor beam and pulled into the center of the earth, and then spending time with giant beings down there and learning that, you know, we're ravaging the surface and all the things that people put behind that today. We just couldn't validate it, George. So we decided, and I'm a scientist, so I don't really believe in anything. I've got to have data. I've got to have proof, pictures, a nut, a bolt, a leaf, a bone, anything. I want something more than personal testimony. I want to witness it and let everybody see it at one time. And I think that'll be an earth-changing event, one way or the other.
I think so too, Brooks. I think so too. And how soon before you think you can wrap things up with the Hollywood folks?
It's working right now. I think they realized that 2012 is about the key window. Because the two ships that are the only two civilian ships on the planet capable of making this voyage for an extended period of time are going to be dry docked the following year. So 2012 is the final time this can ever be done.
And if I remember, it was at least $200,000 to get the ship going, wasn't it?
It was $2 million.
Oh, my gosh, it was off by a zero.
Yeah, those pesky zeros, they're... You know, of course, hey, you're not the Fed. You could just add some if you were them. So
that's right, little fiat money. So what's new with you? What have you been working on?
Well, of course, the electric car company has been the top priority for the last couple of years. And, of course, we're privately held, and last year there were, about 12 electric car companies that were vying for various federal grants and programs that were advertised by the administration, none of which came to pass, I might add. They did for the major car makers, but not for the independents.
Well, Tesla got some money, right?
Yeah, Tesla got some loan guarantees, but they're pretty much in the same boat as everybody. And my hat's off to Elon. He's a household name in the electric car business. He's done a lot for the industry. His cars are awesome. They do a wonderful job. They're in a great niche.
Did he go down personally, financially? I heard rumors that he went bankrupt or something.
Well, I don't know anything about his personal financial situation. I do know that he and his top executives have all put money in the company. They're dedicated to the company. They work there every day. They are totally committed to getting this sedan up and running. And they're making great progress. And I've got to tell you, coming from the automotive industry, he came from a different industry, and some of his executives come from the financial industry. But in the automotive business, to launch a vehicle is about a 5-year-long supertanker. Once you set the course, you better stay on course. There's no turning left or turning right. And there's a little bit of agility to being small and being, closely held. And there's also some problems with a lot of the suppliers not being automotive suppliers. They're not used to the volume. They're not used to the quality levels that American consumers demand out of their vehicles. I mean, we don't want to take our vehicle to the dealer for warranty. We don't want it to break, period. Well, some of the suppliers that are not automotive are not used to that. They're used to a 2% fallout rate. That won't cut it for American auto buyers. So The industry itself has had to go through a metamorphosis from top to bottom, and that's tough to do, especially when the federal government is not supporting the industry the way it said it was going to.
No, not at all. A couple of weeks ago, I had a fellow on who is working on a flying motorcycle. He's got a prototype out there. Neat device. I don't know if it'll work. I don't know if people will buy it, but it is kind of innovative, Brooks.
Well, it would certainly be Darwinian for bad drivers, I think. One of the things that makes this process so difficult is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And I applaud them for their work at trying to make vehicles safer, because not everybody's a great driver. And now we've thrown in the variable of iPhones and Androids, and we're trying to drive and do that at the same time. So it's a good thing that vehicles are getting a lot more safe. And that's kind of what's made the road a little longer, a little more difficult.
I think so, too. How much would it cost to sell a vehicle if you can get it to marketplace?
The Everest, which is our little 100-mile range light pickup truck, will carry about 1,000 pounds, about 100 miles. The retail price is going to be around $25,000, and that's before rebates. Now,
that's not bad.
It's not too bad. Now, the rebates are kind of tricky. The $7,500 one that everyone's heard about only applies to the first 100,000 vehicles from any one plant. That's what the legislation says. It is a tax rebate. So
from any one plant.
From any one plant.
So if you have 10 plants, you've got how many vehicles? 75,000?
Yeah, you could produce 1 million vehicles, then 100,000 vehicles per plant. But the tooling would kill you. You'd never be able to do that. You'd have to tool up one plant and make it go. The rebate is kind of tricky because it's based on income, it's based on the price of the vehicle, and there are some snags to it. If you take the rebate, you're going to get it at tax time, like having a couple extra kids to deduct on your tax return. So it's not at the date of sale, although they're trying to change the legislation to do that. But you also have to waive some of your rights as though you signed a 1040. They have the right to know where the money went. They have the right to investigate if they sense any kind of fraud. And I can see that. I mean,
sure.
The cash for clunkers thing was such a debacle. They don't want to go through that again. The good news is that there are state rebates, there are county rebates, city rebates, and really by the time you become savvy with these, and your local dealer will help you with that, you might get into one of these for $16,000, $17,000, and when you're driving it for basically $20 a month, you're miles ahead of the game.
And is your insurance costs lower?
Yeah, your insurance cost is lower because it only has a 100-mile range, and you're not going to go out and drive 30,000 miles a year in an electric vehicle. That's not what they're made for. They're made for the daily commute, those little short trips, 10, 12, 20, 30 miles, that add up to be 100 miles a day or 150 miles a day.
School, shopping, things like that. Hey, Brooks, stay with us. We're going to come back with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, for just pocket change every day, just pocket change, you can become a Coast Insider. Read all about it, formerly Streamlink, by going to coasttocoastam.com. When we come back, we'll begin to talk about HARP, weather manipulation, with Brooks Agnew right here on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. Brooks, we've talked about HARP on this program before, specifically with Dr. Nick Begich. Tell me about your involvement with HARP.
Well, okay. I published a paper, gosh, I think it was probably back in the mid-'80s, and then I republished it on the Internet, and Nick read that paper. This was, I think, in the mid-'90s, and I had developed an improvement to a technology called ground-probing radar. When I was working on my undergraduate stuff, I ended up in the oil fields doing surveys, and we had a very strange thing happen one day. We used these 6-meter marine radios to communicate in the oil fields. And one day we were in Kentucky, and we were in a known oil area, and we were taking some surveys. And I was communicating with the mobile unit who was out there holding a prismatic mirror that I was going to bounce a laser off of. And I was trying to communicate with him with this 25-watt marine radio, and he couldn't hear me. And we were waving at each other. We could see each other. We were about a quarter of a mile apart, but he couldn't hear me. Well, these radios will go 30 miles sometimes if the conditions are right, but certainly a quarter of a mile. So I motioned for him to drive back over to me, and he came back over to me. I said, hey, why won't you answer me? He said, I'm not hearing anything over the radio. I said, you're kidding me. Where is the radio energy going? So I hooked up a dB meter to the audio output of the other radio. And sure enough, I keyed down on it, and he drove off with the radio keyed down, and he got to a certain spot in this field, and bam, that field just dropped out like it was gone, like it was being sucked straight into the ground. And I said, wow, I wonder what that looks like. So we got a spectrometer, and we put it on a spectrometer kind of shows the different peaks of it, like you're looking at a wave shape on a screen. And sure enough, this thing was dropping about 90 dB. That's like 10 to the ninth. That's how much it was dropping. And then in this was a wave shape that seemed to indicate that something was resonating back some of that energy. And I began to match that against drill cuttings for the next 3 years as my undergraduate program, and thanks to Dr. Buckman at Western Kentucky University, we developed it into a system that we called ground probing radar.
Okay.
And from that point on, we located 55 oil wells in 9 states using this technology, and it worked. It got to depth amazingly accurately, and Halliburton was interested, and I was ready to graduate and move on, so I did. But I paid for part of my college with some of that money, and it was good. But an interesting thing happened when we were up in Roseburg, Oregon, in 1987, I think it was. We were surveying for a gas well for a guy who was a sod farmer. He sold fescue sod. And it was a foggy morning. I had set up my base unit inside of a camper on the back of a Ford four-wheel drive pickup, and the mobile unit was now on an ATV.
You sound like one of those tornado chasers.
Yeah. Oh, we'd really improved the equipment. So he took off driving into the fog, and we're communicating by radio. And then I say, okay, that's, out far enough. Go ahead and turn the equipment on. He turned the equipment on. 50 watts as all this was broadcasting into the ground. And within about 2 seconds, there was a loud bang, and the ground rumbled, and the earth shook. And he came back over the radio, sounded like he was white as a ghost. He said, did I do that? I said, I don't know. What happened? He said, I turned on the broadcaster, and an earthquake happened right underneath me. So we wrote it down in the lab notebook, and that came out in the paper, that maybe we were resonating with something that was already tight as a rubber band underneath the ground, and we triggered it and let it go, and that's what caused it. It was like a cause and effect. So that's what Dr. Begich picked up on in my paper, and he contacted me, and he said, we're doing a documentary called Holes in Heaven, and it's a sequel to his book called Angels Don't Play This Harp.
That's right.
And when his film crew came down and I showed him my data, I spent a day on the phone with Dr. Bernard Eastland, who was the actual patent inventor of HARP. And I was white-faced at the end of this, George, because I realized that they were playing in the same frequencies that I was playing in the mid-'80s, only they weren't playing with 50 watts. They were playing with millions of watts. And I raised an alarm bell. I said, you guys don't know what you're doing. You're like doing this hydrogen bomb thing all over again. You've got to listen to some reason here.
Or maybe they did know, Brooks, what they were doing. If you get
well, that's even more frightening if that's true, because
yes, it is.
Besides the side effects of being able to trigger earthquakes, and there, by the way, there's some telltale signs that HARP is a predecessor to these, manipulating weather by moving clouds around, and we can certainly talk about what we did with the History Channel and with True TV with Jesse Ventura. There's also the danger of a solar tap, and we can get into that later. That's a real scary one.
Let's get into the triggering of earthquakes with this technology a little bit more, and how it works.
Well,
what happens?
It's that's a good question. It's hard to do on the radio because I'm sitting here with my hands in the room and you can't see it. Let's say you had an acoustical guitar out of its case and it was leaned up against the wall in the corner of your room, and then you turned your stereo up loud with rock and roll music on it. Somewhere in that music, a frequency will be just right to pluck a string on that guitar just as surely as someone went over and plucked it with a pick. Actually, what's happening is the guitar is absorbing energy out of the room full of noise that's exactly the right frequency that's perfect for that string to vibrate. This is how HAARP triggers earthquakes. HAARP is the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. It is designed to create a radio frequency beam, like we're talking over the radio right now, with a lower frequency message carried on top of it, like our voices are going over the radio right now.
Yeah.
They send ELF, which is extremely low frequencies, VLF, and ULF signals, obviously extreme, very, and ultra-low frequencies. Now, these have a lot of applications. Of course, communicating with submarines was their primary budget reason. But as it turns out, some of these frequencies, as Dr. Nick Begich will testify, can have biological and physiological effects, and others can have geological effects, like the guitar string in the corner of the room. The ground, structures in the ground can vibrate with those very low frequencies. And obviously, the louder you turn the music up, the harder the string on the guitar vibrates. So the idea was to maybe use it to do kind of a CAT scan of the earth, to look for oil, to look for water, to look for precious metals in the ground. But when it's concentrated and turned on certain areas that have a propensity for geotechnic activity, which we now call earthquakes,
yep.
It could trigger them. And we did it with 50 watts. And there's some evidence that it has been done with not maybe our HAARP, but other HAARPs that are existing on the planet.
This rumble that you heard with the 50-watter,
yes.
How loud was it?
Well, it was audible, but it was such that it's sort of like somebody grabbing the carpet you're standing on and giving it a whip. It was like a wave that just went under us. It rocked the whole camper. It was probably a 4.5 or 5 earthquake. And for, Oregon, that's not uncommon. But to have it cause an effect like that was notable. So we made a note of it.
But you're pretty sure, though, you triggered it.
Well, I would say it's cause and effect. I wouldn't say that I could go out and cause an earthquake every single time. I'm saying that the conditions were just right, and we added that extra push, that activation energy that caused it to slip and cause the earthquake.
So if you had a bigger device, i.e. HAARP, turned it on, it could do, in your opinion, some incredible damage.
Well, not just in my opinion. There are a lot of experts that agree on this, so much so that there was a treaty drafted shortly after HAARP was built. And in that treaty, the United States agreed, and this was signed by Secretary of State Cohen, not to use HAARP as a weapon.
How do we know that HAARP wasn't developed for that purpose?
Well, I would say, based on our illustrious, trustworthy Wars R Us department, that probably the opposite is true. And I mentioned in the start of this segment that it's the same mentality as those that launched the first hydrogen bomb. I did some of my postgraduate work in Oak Ridge, so you hear some of the stories of those who worked on the Manhattan Project. In fact, one of the guys that sells me equipment was a Marine colonel that was over the task force to watch Oppenheimer during his work with the crew. And so he heard a lot of stories, and some of the concerns that they were talking about is, if we set this thing off, there's a chance we could light the whole atmosphere of the Earth on fire. George, that's a tremendous risk. That's a real downside for me.
Absolutely. Well, when they were developing, Brooks, as you know, the atomic bomb, some of them actually thought we were going to ignite the atmosphere.
So if you have a downside like that, even thought of by the very scientists that are developing the system for you, what kind of insanity would actually push the button and take the chance?
Well, we know that, don't we?
Yes, we do.
You had mentioned the name of Dr. Bernard Eastland. Tell us a little bit more about him.
Well, a very innovative inventor and certainly a physicist. When I met him and I talked to him, he had a million ideas a second. He was commissioned by the United States Navy to come up with ideas for how to use a tremendous amount of natural gas, which the Navy had on their property on the North Slope of Alaska. This was his proposal, these 7 patents that were filed, and the Navy liked it because it had the aspects of weaponry, it had the aspects of clandestine communications with submarines so that they could direct what we call the Marconi effect, and I'll explain that in a second. And it also was something that was technologically achievable. And so when they built it, I don't really think they thought about the downsides. When I started doing the calculations and getting back with Dr. Eastland about what we call the ionospheric breakdown, the solar tap, he was pretty scared about it too, and that's why he agreed to participate with Dr. Begich and myself and Gene Manning and Flanagan to produce this video called Holes in Heaven.
Was he the kind of guy, is he the kind of guy who would get upset if he knew technology was being used for the wrong purpose?
Yeah, he would. In fact, he had a gag order on him for a number of years after he produced the patents. Obviously, these things were put under NSA seal, and they weren't for public perusal. But once that gag order was lifted, and it was somewhere in the mid-'90s, I'm thinking 95, 96, 97, somewhere in there, then he was able to contribute to the documentary. And I didn't keep up with him too much after that, but I understand he didn't live too much longer after that.
Let's hope they didn't do him in.
Well, he wasn't a particularly old fellow, so I don't really know what happened.
Well, you don't know. Okay. Scientists are beginning to tell us now publicly that they manipulate weather. They've done it in the Middle East. They've done it in China. I'm sure they've done it here, Brooks. What do you hear?
Well, it's certainly possible. When the HAARP is fired off, one of its first qualities is an ionospheric heater. It heats up the ionosphere. It shoves energy into a section of the atmosphere around the Earth that doesn't normally get energy from the Earth. It usually gets it from the sun. That's why we get the auroras that we see over both poles. That's where it got its name, the Auroral Research Program, because when they fired this unit off, this phased array of antennas, and they got the power up sufficiently, it created an aurora when it hit the sky. It poured so much energy into the molecules that are well spaced apart up there in space, up in the upper atmosphere. They put off light because they couldn't get rid of the energy any other way. We see it as light. But those ions are constantly charged up. And the more energy you pump into the ionosphere, the more potential you have for an accident. So when you shove this ionosphere out into space, you create kind of a giant parabolic dish. The Marconi effect, which is named after the guy who discovered it, he bounced radio waves from the east coast of the United States to Paris over the ocean, which is, of course, well over the horizon. Sure. But it only worked some of the time because the ionosphere doesn't always cooperate. That's why when you're down in Amarillo, Texas, you can pick up the Chicago AM station some nights because the ionosphere is just right. It'll skip off the ionosphere, and you can pick it up down in Texas. Of course, it's a 75,000-watt blowtorch, too, but still, it gets down there. But if you can manipulate the ionosphere, push it where you want it to go, then you can bounce signals off and direct them where you want to go, i.e. to submarines that are out at sea. Nobody else can listen in because then the signals become kind of unidirectional and reliable and very low power and targeted. Well, if you can communicate with subs, then you can also communicate with other areas of the planet. And so more and more experiments hit the docket, and as they were pushing the ionosphere out on a regular basis and pushing these frequencies out, they realized they had side effects. And in 1991, when they really started playing with it heavily, they experimented with it as non-lethal weaponry. This is what they call it, where they push ELF into the battlefield, in other words, an area that you want to invade, and they do what they call attrit the soldiers, attrition.
Now, what is that?
They keep them up for 30 days, no sleep, nightmares, anxiety, diarrhea, nervousness, paranoia. They pump these frequencies into the minds of the soldiers that are about to be invaded. And after 30 days, they're as weak as kittens, and they just come walking out of the shelters and won't even fight.
Have we used this?
Yes, we have, and we use it in the battlefield today. We have portable models of it. We pull them up with trucks to an area that we want to invade or to go in and clean up. We turn the unit on, and a few hours later, the soldiers walk in and meet hardly any resistance.
It doesn't single out just soldiers, though, Brooks. I'm sure it hits citizens, too.
It sure does. But it is non-lethal weaponry, so they consider it not a violation of the Geneva Convention.
I do know they have sound apparatus, right, where they turn it on and they basically pierces their ears.
Yeah, the sonic weaponry is just super high, intense, high decibel weaponry. They use it on every cruise ship is mounted with sonic cannons to keep hijackers from boarding them from the sea. But these are subsonic. These you cannot hear. These are waves that do things to the neurological systems of the human body.
And they have no idea that it's been turned on, do they?
That's correct. They don't hear anything. They don't suspect anything. And they're getting better and better at it. And, of course, Dr. Begich is much more well-qualified to talk about those effects than I am. But I became not worried about the ELF frequencies so much, the earthquake tendencies, but more about the RF being pushed up into the ionosphere, because this is like a giant ground wire being thrown up into the sky. And for those of we could pick it up on the next segment.
Yeah, we'll do that. And I also want to talk about the Japanese earthquake, because some say HAARP may have been turned on during that same time period. We'll be back. Well, can they actually use a device like HAARP and create earthquakes, affect the weather? We'll be back with more with Dr. Brooks Agnew in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Brooks, during the Japanese earthquake several weeks ago, do you know if there was any kind of a spike from HAARP? Some people have told me there was.
Well, the spike that people talk about, there are actually two of them. One is a changing of the sky into kind of a lavender hue, the auroral effect of the high frequency affecting the sky above where this earthquake is going to happen. And the other is a ham radio being able to pick up that 2-meter phased array carrier frequency from HAARP. I'm not familiar with any data that shows the latter was there, and this earthquake did happen during the daytime, so it's difficult to tell whether there was the auroral signature. Now, Japan is in a really strange geological location in the sense that it's right at the edge of the Pacific Rim, so obviously there's a lot of tension there all the time. Japan is really just a string of volcanoes, not the least of which is Mount Fuji. And you remember about a month before this happened, they had a volcano erupt that was dormant for some 200 years. That happened right after a geomagnetic storm hit the Earth from the sun. So there are some other effects that could have made this especially tense in the area. But Japan also sits in between the Chinese HAARP, the Russian HAARP,
That's right.
and the U.S. HARP up in Alaska. So it's difficult to tell which one might have been used. And in cases like this, where you're looking at a target of multiple weapon systems, it might be smart to just follow the money. See who had the most to gain from an earthquake like this happening